legislative session. And now, please welcome Dr. Garvin.
I had originally thought when I saw how enormous the crowd was that I might forego the formalities and come down there and just talk my speech. But it's being a video, and it will be more convenient for them if I go through with the original plan. It's also the case, this is all preliminary to the speech, that I've written the speech, which is not what I ordinarily do. Ordinarily I talk off the cuff at great length. But this I'll be reading, and those of you who know me know that reading is sometimes a strain. So if you see me reaching for things like my magnifying glass, you'll know why. But I'll proceed as if the place is packed, although I will change one line in the speech as a result of the fact that only the great and faithful are here tonight. Hello. Nice to see you. Thank you for being here. It's a celebration, and I'm in the mood. A moment ago, I thought I heard Lionel Richie coaxing us to party until the crack of dawn. We've come to mark two celebrations. 225 years ago, and here I have to disagree with Susie, 34 men agreed on the new Constitution. Some of these men were already great, like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Some would become great, like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Others were obscure then and are forgotten now. Hold a kind thought, will you please, for Jacob Broome and William Few. These men had sweated through a hot Philadelphia summer. They'd done good work but not A-plus work. On the last day, Franklin admitted that the Constitution wasn't perfect. But he hoped that each delegate would do as he had done and doubt a little of his own infallibility. Give the new government a chance, he urged. Bless old Ben for his wisdom, bless the others for going along. Forgive Randolph, Gary, and Mason, who refused to sign then but came around later. Thank the first Congress for finishing some of the unfinished work, for passing the Bill of Rights and the Judiciary Act, for example. These 18th century men immodestly claimed to design for eternity, to build for eternity. With the Constitution as its foundation, the new government would last, and it would bind the country together. And so it has. Once in a while, Governor Perry curls from the woodwork. A little over a year ago, he told an Austin Tea Party crowd that Texas might be better off going to the North. It's as if Perry turned his back on our founders, as if he forgot, too, about the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln. Remember what the words say, the ones behind Lincoln's statue, monument, and memorial in D.C. In this temple, and in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. Getting Mississippi and Maine together again was costly. Over 600,000 American lives lost. That's a dozen Vietnams. The Union endured. Grant and Sherman saw to that. But Lincoln, the emancipator, made the Union, all of it, free. And Congress pushed through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Once ratified, the Civil War amendments put the country on a new foundation, a firmer foundation. The Constitution that emerged from Lincoln's war, the fundamental law we live under today, was better, more just than the original. Now the Constitution banned legal slavery forever and guaranteed all of us the equal protection of the law. We celebrate that. In his more lucid moments, I'm sure the Governor Perry does too. The second anniversary is our own. Gonzaga is 125 years old. The college is. Gonzaga University is a year 100. In 1881, Pocatawla plunked down $936 to buy land for Gonzaga. 6 years later, our school joined the crowded ranks of American colleges. In our country, it's hard to turn around without stumbling over a college. We've never lacked for these serious-minded places. In 1831, the French writer and politician Alexis de Tocqueville, a favorite of mine, came to America to see what was up. 2 months into his trip, he nearly drowned when his steamer capsized on the Ohio River. Saved, dried out, and reboarded, he disembarked in the bustling frontier town of Cincinnati. He met interesting people there, including 2 future Supreme Court justices, and he learned new things. He learned that Cincinnati was a way station, a place where ambitious mechanics and artisans from New York or Baltimore made a few bucks before turning themselves into Illinois farmers. He learned that Democratic Ohio had elected a former street peddler to state office over the distinguished General William Henry Harrison. Tocqueville also heard about America's passion for education. In Ohio, this passion played out in a way that helps explain our abundance of colleges. A spirited rivalry enlivened the state. Each group of faithful Christians who entered Ohio, coming downriver from Pittsburgh or along the shore of Lake Erie from Buffalo, brought its own notion of how to save souls. Each needed its fresh crop of ministers to carry on the work. Ministers needed to be educated. So did deacons and bishops and such. So each group founded a college. I quote from the noted historian of American higher education, Frederick Rudolph. Of course, the busiest agent of all this college building were the religious denominations, some more so than others, some later than others, but few were not involved. They worked in an environment of national ambition, democratic aspiration, geographic isolation, and romantic imagination. And state by state, they turned their own rivalries into sets of competing colleges. As the population moved westward, so did the denominations. Every state became a battlefield. Not a real war, of course, and nobody assaulted anybody. Not yet. That would come half a century later when college football got invented. Rudolph goes on. Few states were as productive as Ohio, where the rate of survival was apparently high. Franklin, Presbyterian. Western Reserve, Congregationalist. Kenyon, Episcopalian. Denison, Baptist. Oberlin, Congregationalist. Marietta, Congregationalist. Muskingum, United Presbyterian. St. Xavier, Roman Catholic. Ohio Wesleyan, Methodist. Mount Union, Methodist. Baldwin, Methodist. Wittenberg, Lutheran. Otterbein, United Brethren. Heidelberg, Reformed. Urbana, Swedenborgian. Antioch, Christian. Hiram, Disciples. All were founded before 1850 and without the usual spate of Presbyterian colleges, which were not that needed in Ohio since the Presbyterians had captured the 2 state colleges, Miami and Ohio. I remember reading years ago that there were more colleges in Ohio than in all of Europe. I'm not sure about that now. Granted, the average student body of Ohio's colleges were about the same as the crowd here tonight. Didn't stop with Ohio. It wouldn't stop with Cataldo either. More and more of these small places where the campus was only a single building, and land-grant agricultural and mechanical colleges, and normal schools. Then, following the lead of Johns Hopkins, old colleges like Harvard and Yale became European-style universities. In 1900, the vast Russian Empire boasted 8 universities. New York City had more than that by itself. As orange groves and desert waste disappeared in post-World War II California, public colleges and universities by the score sprang up to serve the burgeoning population. Students packed the parking lots of new community colleges from Eureka to Varsity. Other states followed suit. Religious differences among American colleges gradually softened. Today, our colleges, particularly the smaller ones, call to mind churches, gas stations, and shoe stores. Too many of them selling the same product. They can't all do well. Many, very many small, meagerly financed colleges have folded like that rented tent I once tried to put up on a windy afternoon in Yosemite, not realizing at first that they were short a key pole. The key pole for a college is always money. Father Cataldo's investment was not sure to pay off, but Cataldo and Redmond and their Jesuit brethren were tough, and they got Gonzaga through the early days. Yet going broke has seldom been out of the question. I remember a visit by the Oregon Provincial in the early 1970s, 1973 or 74 must have been. He told us teachers, nervous Nellies all, that the province sponsored 2 good colleges, but given money woes, that might be 1 too many. Bless Barney Coughlin and his trustees for getting us through that hard time. Bless Thane McCullough and all who help us get by even today. We're a strong, going enterprise. That doesn't mean that it's ever easy. We've survived, both we the country and we the college. We've done more than survive. In many ways, we've fulfilled our founders' hopes. So we celebrate, and I get to talk. My friend and colleague, Professor Michael Leiserson, and I gave the first Constitution Day talk some years ago. We explained what the Constitution was about. I explored its mechanics. He dealt with its spirit. And we can dig into those topics later, if you would like. On that warm September evening, there was no need to mention Gonzaga's history. This night is different. The Constitution and Gonzaga, I must plunge into both topics at once, as if they had something in common. As if I could swim both waters with equal ease. I had a strange thought. I might present you with column A and column B. Like those helpful Chinese menus for bewildered diners, neophytes puzzled by their choices. To golden fish tiles with strange taste sauce to go with a broccoli tofu stir fry. Let's see, does a clear understanding of the Commerce Clause help us understand why GU's tuition keeps going up? Now, it's better to look for a unifying idea, one that makes sense, whether it's the country and the Constitution we're talking about, or Gonzaga's commitment to humanistic, Catholic, and Jesuit education. I found such an idea, a simple one, really. Here it is. In our lives, we're drawn in two contrary directions. One leads to continuity, even repetition. We want the calm that comes of order that Augustine wrote about centuries ago. This desire leads us to form habits and to make rules. Think about rules. Rules tell us what we should do. We're secure when we follow the rules. Going down a safe, familiar path comforts us. But we also want to break free, to strike out in new, untried directions. Sometimes we're willing to give up comfort and safety for adventure. In this mood, rules annoy us. We wonder why we need so many and why they have to be so minute. If only the air weren't so thick with rules, so suffocating. I say that we make rules, but that's not the whole story. Sometimes we inherit them. They are there before we appear on the scene. We accept them as givens. Sometimes we do this cheerfully. We embrace the past. Sometimes we don't, finding the rules made by others, dead people, to be grisly about it, not to our liking. We have a tension to manage. Go too far in one direction or the other, and we may be in trouble. Too accepting of rules, we may grow pinched and uncreative. Too insistent on freedom, we may turn wild and unpredictable and foolishly destructive. Balance restraint and freedom properly, and we may end up happy. That makes sense, right? Adventure, believe me, new exciting things are happening at our vibrant university. 3 weeks ago, with his usual warmth and vigor, President McCullough wowed the faculty. 10 years from now, he told us, everybody in the country will see GU as one of the top universities. And this is what can happen when you set minds free. Nevertheless, in my talk tonight, I will pay more attention to continuity than to change. This is perhaps fitting on an anniversary. Let's turn to my title. My title will lead to a story. I'm afraid that telling the story will take a little time. You may wonder what happened to the Constitution and to Gonzaga, but when story time is over, I will hammer home my point about continuity. Here goes. The title of my talk is to be looked upon with other reverence, or what the broken jaw of a green plastic alligator can teach us about Gonzaga University and our country. The first part, the reverence part, comes from Edmund Burke. He was born in Ireland in 1729, went to London when he was 21, lived an active life there as a man of letters and a politician, and died in 1797. He was 3 years older than Washington, a senior when George was a freshman. Burke was a friend of the Americans in the years leading up to the Revolution. He said that the British government shouldn't impose new taxes on the colonies simply because they had always voted their own taxes. Burke was conservative. He believed in honoring old rules that worked. He believed that people ought to be grateful for, even reverential toward, practices their ancestors had handed down to them. Like other conservatives, Burke wasn't convinced that people are smart. That's not quite it. One by one, people might not display genius. But given a few centuries, people could come up with good practices. Wisdom showed itself in time Once in a while, something might go haywire. So the English had to fix things in 1688 when they kicked out the would-be Catholic tyrant, James II, and secured the Protestant line. But you don't toss a good tool on the scrap heap just because it's old. This is the way Burke saw hereditary succession to the throne. It was a good tool. Despite James, the practice had proved itself. Far better to stay with it than to turn to some god-awful notion of letting the people choose their own ruler. In 1790, it was the crazies in France who upset Burke. For over a year, rampaging revolutionaries had broken all the rules. Burke watched in horror as they screamed for freedom, looting and burning in their heedless pursuit of the rights of man. Upset, Burke was furious. But he was calm enough to write a long book about the earthquake in France. At one point in his reflections on the revolution in France, one of history's great diatribes, Burke considered the idea of a social contract. This was a metaphor much fancied by liberal writers. Hobbes used it, Locke used it, Rousseau used it. The French revolutionaries made it their own. They all imagined people living in a state of nature without any authority to restrain them, coming together finally to form a good society with just rules that would honor and protect their rights. What nonsense, Burke said. There was no such state of nature, no natural rights, no contract to protect them. Better to talk about habits, ways of doing things that grew gradually in the midst of real life in a particular civilized community. People nurtured these habits because they were useful. Rights, if that word was to be used, were expectations born of shared experience and mutual forbearance. Burke rejected the liberal idea of social contract, but he was willing to take liberal language for his own purposes. Here's the beautiful passage in which he did this. It's also the passage my title borrows words from. Society is indeed a contract. Subordinate contracts for objects of mere occasional interest may be dissolved at pleasure, but the state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership agreement in the trade of pepper and coffee, calico or tobacco, or some other such low concern, to be taken up for a little temporary interest and to be dissolved by the fancy of the parties. It is to be looked upon with other reverence, because it is not a partnership in things subservient only to the gross animal existence of a temporary and perishable nature. It is a partnership in all sciences, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue, and in all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. Each contract of each particular state is but a clause in the great primeval contract of eternal society, linking the lower with the higher nature, connecting the visible and invisible world, according to a fixed compact, sanctioned by the inviolable oath which holds all physical and all nature, each in their appropriate place. My goodness. Partnership in all science, all art, every virtue, a partnership spanning generations. We can think about our country this way. We carry on the word. Madison and Hamilton and the others began when they wrote the Constitution. Like Lincoln, we strive for a more perfect union. And we hand the burden we can no longer lift to our children and grandchildren. But Burke's words could be spoken of a university too, don't you think? Here we are, carrying on the work of Father Cataldo, and far beyond him, of Ignatius himself. And we look forward to the help of Zags, not yet born. Slight chill along your spine. You ready for the second part of the title? Let's get to the alchemy. Not a slimy 15-footer slipping down a muddy bank in the dark water. A brittle, little green plastic one. Something you could hold between two fingers. My alligator plays a part in a story I promised to tell you. A story about a town, a man who lived there, his family, and his house. The town was laid out in the late 1880s. 4 intersecting streets, 2 running north-south, 2 east-west. 5 wooden frame buildings the first year, more than 20 a summer later. Like a lot of western towns, it owed its life to the farmer's need to bring crops to a hub for transport. And like a lot of towns, it didn't take off until a railroad spur arrived, in this case in its 3rd year. Smith, the man I want to tell you about, arrived 2 summers after that. An educated, enterprising young man of 19, a sophomore by our record. He was ambitious and energetic. Before he was 20, he'd opened a small hardware store. Because it was needed, and because he was fair and reliable and hardworking, it grew into a large store, large by the standards of his town. Smith joined a couple of other young fellows as partners in the fledgling bank, and still others in a livery stable. He didn't grow fabulously rich, but he did prosper. 20 years down the road, he was the mayor of the town. He was also a family man with a wife and 4 kids. It was time to build a big house. But the star of my story isn't Smith, it's Jane, his great-great-granddaughter. Of course, she never knew him. As a little girl, she giggled at his portrait at the top of the main staircase of his old house. The round-faced man with funny glasses and bushy mustache. She had no idea then that he was trying, without success, to look like Teddy Roosevelt. Fact is, Smith's brood ran into a lot of bad luck long before Jane's time. 2 of the boys were lost in the Great War. His wife succumbed to the Spanish flu. Instead of those huge, sprawling families, with aunts and uncles popping in for every picnic, cousins tumbling over cousins, this one dwindled. To Martha, Smith's granddaughter, and Jane and Matt, Martha's grandniece and nephew. Martha spent most of her widowhood in the house before moving into the care facility. Then she died. In her will, she left the old house jointly to the 2 youngsters, Jane and Matt, both now in their early 50s. Jane lived briefly in the house when she was a kid, while Dad was stationed in Maria. She and her mother rattled around the old place. It warmed Martha's heart to hear them there, to have them there, and to hear the clatter. Jane could picture herself in every room. Funny, she couldn't remember Matt in the house at all. His province was 3 blocks away, the 40 acres back of the old Miller place. There in the sluggish creek beyond. He and his buddies, Martha called them the field mice, were too busy scurrying about to show up in the picture. Now Jane was back in the house, alone in her house for the first time. She walked through the parlor, the living room, the music room with Martha's upright piano, the 2 downstairs bedrooms, the kitchen, a really spacious, well-lit kitchen. Every room brought back a memory. Now the stairs. Halfway up, Jane ran her hand over the nick in the wood, the result, she'd been told, of a mistimed slide by Martha's little brother. He conked his head as he fell. Not fatally, thank goodness. The fatal fall would come 70 years later. Broken hip, blood clot. Jane turned right at the top of the stairs. There was the bedroom that was once her mother's. The daughter went in, softly, as if she might disturb her long-dead mother's rest. Suddenly she wondered, do you suppose it's still there? The bureau was. There against the east wall, next to the window where the morning light poured in. She walked to the bureau. She knelt. She looked as if she might be praying. She touched the keyhole in the bottom drawer and then peered closely for a rough edge she thought she felt. It was there. Definitely there, a rough little piece of green plastic jammed into the keyhole. My God, after all these years. Jane remembered the day. She'd been playing alone in her mother's room, something not altogether allowed. Sitting on the bed, bored, she fiddled with a toy alligator, a souvenir from some forgotten school carnival or church fair. The jaw was hinged. It moved slightly up and down. A little boy's pleasure, perhaps, but not something that could interest Jane for long. Then she noticed the keyhole. The next step was irresistible, of course, even for a well-mannered girl. She pushed the jaw into the keyhole. As she pushed it in, delighted at the close fit, the jaw snapped. Uh-oh. She couldn't get it out. So she pushed it further in, as far as she could. Now the rough surface of the broken jaw was flush with the sides of the keyhole. Maybe her mother would notice. She didn't tell her mother, or Martha, or Matt, or anybody else. Nobody ever said anything about it. Now, decades later, as she looked at the piece of green plastic, still jammed in the keyhole, something strange happened. All the years between shrank to nothing. They blew away like white bits of fluff on a dandelion gone to seed. The child Jane knew deep comfort in this house, a comfort that came rushing over the woman Jane. Her mom was in the room, a presence almost as real as Jane herself. She must have known but said nothing. Jane could feel her love. She could almost smell her mother's sweetness. Jane cried. Dabbing a Kleenex at her cheek, she wished she could stay in the moment. There in that room in the old house, Then she began to think hard, and by evening, she'd hatched a plan. Jane had always dreamed of opening a bed and breakfast. Friends told her she was a great cook, famous for her egg sardou with the bright lemony hollandaise sauce. Her husband, Frank, hated his boss and yearned for a change. He was handy around the house and loved to garden. Jane and Frank didn't live high in the hog. They hadn't had children of their own. That would have been a blessing, but an expensive one. As it was, they had enough money to fix the wiring and to install air conditioning. They could borrow for whatever else they needed to bring the old house up to code. She imagined weekend guests, glistening refugees from the heat of the city. She imagined slick ads in travel magazines that would lure long-distance vacationers off the freeway. She would tell her brother about her plan tomorrow when he came in from the east. Matt had a good job, he could help. The next day, Jane waited for Matt at the coffee shop on Smith Street. Yes, Smith Street, renamed when the old man died in 1930. Java Joe's had been there for years. So far, the town was too small for a Starbucks, but this place was not altogether old-fashioned. It had an adequate espresso machine. At the door, there was Matt, tall and straight as ever, but balder and graying around the temples, looking more and more like Dad. Warm greetings, hugs and kisses. They settled down over their coffee. His a double espresso, hers a vanilla latte, to talk about the house. I have an idea, Jane said. Me too, Matt came back enthusiastically. I've been thinking about it ever since we heard. Jane deferred to her brother. Well, he said, you know, the freeway has made the trip from town pretty quick. I got here from the airport in half an hour. More and more people are living out in this neck of the woods, too. Yes, yes, Jane said, sensing where he was going. The bed and breakfast was one step closer to reality. She could see it, the house bright with new paint, Frank's flower beds in full bloom, couples lugging in their bags, mounting the 3 steps to the Queen Anne porch, blueberry muffins warm from the oven. So here's what we do, Matt said. We bulldoze the old wreck and put up cheap apartments. We'll make a bundle. End of story. I confess I told this story before to students in my modern political thought class. When I was done, I told them that the story wasn't true. I made it all up. Yes, it's a fabrication except for the green alligator and what happened to it. It was my toy. It was my mother's bureau. It was me who never told anybody. It was me who found the broken jaw years later. It was me who got teary-eyed. Because we had begun to read Burke, my students saw why I told the story. To help them feel better about that challenging writer. After all, it's not easy to warm up to somebody who holds these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created unequal. That God intends for better people to rule worse ones. And that everybody should fall into line behind the stage of religion. They saw that in one way Jane was Burke. She shared Burke's deep desire to preserve a precious inheritance. Later on, I was able to show them who Matt was. He was Tom Paine. Paine had tried to skewer Burke as a 1790 polemic the rights of man, a lengthy defense of the French Revolution. Like Paine, Mapp believed that the world belongs to the living, to be used for their convenience. He didn't want Smith's icy dead fingers clutching at his throat, if he remembered Smith at all. Let's admit this on that side. An old house can be a wreck, and living in one a pain. The pipes rattle. The ancient octopus furnace doesn't keep all of the rooms warm, at least not unless you spend a fortune. The wooden floor in the living room may be expensive polished oak, but it sags. As Jane saw, though, living in an old house can do wonders for your soul. Especially if it's a good house your family has lived in for a long time. Familiarity breeds comfort, not content. I wanted you to feel Jane's comfort and her love for her house, her mother, her past. And I wanted you to remember how an object, even an insignificant piece of broken plastic, can make us children again. Hammer poised, here's my point. I suspect that some of what Jane felt is inside you. I suspect that you have a deep connection to place too. This place, to Gonzaga. Walk outside tonight, out on the brick path, and try to conjure up the past. This may sound really silly, but let brick and mortar be your alligator. Let what you see touch your heart the way that Jane's heart was touched. Every morning, I park by Robinson House. I walk to my fourth floor office in College Hall. Okay, I ride the elevator to my fourth floor office. On the way, I see where Boone Avenue once ran through. I don't go far enough back to see streetcars, but I can look east to what was once a dirt parking lot with a little restaurant in the southeast corner, May Ryan's place, the one with all the GU football pictures. In one of the booths, I can see Franz Schneider and Tom Rukavina arguing politics, while Bob Gilmore looks on bemusedly. If I cut through the ad building, sorry, College Hall, I will walk past the classroom where I met my first students in 1971. Tim Lyons, Libby Clark, Blaine Harden, John Ely, and others. Next door, I will see the classroom where in 1972 I met my wife Susan. I might see a ghost, friendly ghost. It might be tall, ambling, hard to do so. What will you see? Gonzaga is our old house, an old house we shared with ones dear to us. In an earlier time, when people were not embarrassed by sentiment, students and alumni sang to their colleges. Hail to thee, our dear mother. We need to talk about love of country. You can fill in the argument, I think, about how as youngsters we get attached to a place, Butte or Boston, say. How our experience broadens. We come to appreciate other places. How we become deeply conscious of ourselves as Americans. All of this, whether or not we know the difference between Article 1 and Article 6 of the Constitution. I'll cut this off because I remember something else from Tocqueville. There was nothing, he wrote, more annoying than an American's patriotism. Not satisfied with living in a good country, the American fills your ears with exaggerated boasts about living in the best country there Earlier, I said we had a tension to manage, a tension between self-imposed restraint and freedom. We can embrace a familiar past with all of its comforts, or we can reach for freedom, striking out in an untried direction. We would be wise, I said, to try to balance both rather than to pursue either exclusively. Tonight it's true, I've looked backwards, I've been nostalgic. Like Jane, I've also understood that to affirm the past is to accept restraint. We at Gonzaga limit ourselves as we carry on Jesuit tradition. We set our feet on a particular path. We insist on rules for ourselves and for those in our charge. What do we say to the student who doesn't want to take required courses? We citizens limit ourselves too when we abide by the Constitution, the law of the land. Like Aristotle, we understand that the best laws are no good unless they're well obeyed. We rightly see the Constitution as the foundation of our freedom. We may forget that its authors were also intent on imposing restraints. Hamilton was blunt about this. He said that the radical vice of the old government under the Articles of Confederation was that it couldn't coerce citizens. It couldn't tax them, or conscript them into an army, or throw them into jail. The new government could, and that was what was good about it. We accept restraints, but that doesn't mean that we resist change, that we never budge. Gonzaga and America have this in common. They are both living places, good ones, whose survival depends on our love and reverence. But neither Gonzaga nor America is exactly the way it used to be. Not the same as in the beginning. Not the same as when we first opened our eyes to the world around us. Not the same as they were just a few years ago. The fact of change should not dismay us, even if we treasure the past. Jane didn't want to laminate Smith's house. She wanted to preserve it, yes, but also to make it useful again. She wouldn't tear the house down the way Matt would, but she would fix the wiring. In this, it turns out, Jane was also correct. Choosing continuity does not foreclose change. Far from it, it only favors change of a certain kind. Old places from time to time have to be refreshed, refurbished, reformed. But reform should be in the style of the building, the phrase Burke himself used. Let me show you two examples, and then I'll quit. At Gonzaga, we're currently modernizing the core curriculum. But we're not acting like the French Revolutionaries. We are not driving Matt's bulldozer, giddily knocking down the old requirements. We are preserving much of the old curriculum because it has proved itself over the decades. We reform in the style of the building. Almost every year, somebody wants to amend the Constitution in this way or that. Most such reforms fail, and for good reason. I will suggest reform too, although its chances of success are about the same as my chance of breaking the world's high jump record. I would abolish the electoral college. The college hasn't been the independent body of decision makers, its creators and vision for a very long time, since Jefferson challenged Adams in 1796, I'd say.
political parties got invented, electors became party people, putting their seal of approval on their candidate. In most elections since 1796, the college has done what the majority has said it should. Once in a long while, though, our old-fashioned system screws things up. Remember 12 years ago. State by state, electors voted the way they were supposed to. But because of how the popular vote was spread across the country, the wrong man won. George W. Bush came in second in 2000, not first. Yet he became president. This should be intolerable in a democracy. To substitute direct election for the current indirect method would not be a fundamental change. It would leave the separation of powers alone. It would leave our rights in place. It, too, would be a reform in the style of government. Well, that's my take on things. I hope the rest of your evening is great and that you will remember to love